Hello, and welcome to the Schmidt List, the podcast for people dedicated to managing successful projects, developing impactful products, and building engaged teams. And now, here's your host, Kurt Schmidt.
Hello, and welcome to episode 13 of the Schmidt List. On today's show, I'm talking to Patrick Fuentes, Android domain lead at The Nerdery. We discuss how mobile designers and developers can work better together, and we also try to answer the question, will progressive web applications replace native mobile apps? Patrick also shares his top 3 tips if you're considering a mobile application build. It's a fun conversation. So without further ado, here's my discussion with Patrick. Hi, Patrick. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing good. Thanks for coming on the show. So, Patrick, your background is in mobile development. Specifically, Android has been a focus of yours as of recent. How did you get your start in development?
I had kind of a circuitous path, I'll say.
Ooh, I love that word.
Yeah. In a past life, I was very convinced that I wanted to be an academic and was following the path of being a teacher.
Okay.
Specifically, my licensure and master's are in technology education, so specialized in learning about technology and teaching people about it. At one point, I was working with some colleagues, some friends, and teaching kids how to program and how to make apps and, do other stuff too, like build robots, whatever. And we were lamenting the challenges of being a teacher and question, why don't we try making apps ourselves? So a few friends and I ended up starting a small company on our own, just doing client services. And we were in the black and had traction. Stuff was going pretty well. And
cool.
One thing led to another. And here I am making mobile apps today.
When you were first getting into mobile, obviously that was probably pretty early on. What were some of the initial challenges that you felt that you were faced when developing mobile applications originally?
Yeah, there are a lot of them.
Is it just the sheer amount of devices was an issue, or was it the language wasn't mature enough? Like what were you running into early on that was probably the things that taught you a lot? Yeah,
so I would say a challenge that was maybe a little bit specific to me was, as you mentioned, I have a mobile background and I do specialize in Android right now, but I did iOS development in the past as well. And going back and forth between Android development and iOS development, I became really aware of the unique differences, the strengths and weaknesses that each platform brings to the table. I became even more aware of how uncommon that understanding was, and how that can present challenges.
There's PHP, front-end, .NET, Android, iOS. Is it because those languages are so different that there isn't a lot of people that do both Android and iOS? Is it because it's such a big difference in how you do the development?
The differences stand out for sure. For me, the reason that I've chosen to pull back a bit and focus on one platform more than the other is just that there's an incredible surface to cover. And I enjoy being a generalist in a lot of things. I think to be able to keep up with the depth and breadth and complexity of APIs that are constantly changing on each platform, you really do need to spend some time with just one platform.
With the Android platform specifically, what are some of the biggest changes you've seen just in the last few years? Things in terms of how you do development. Has it gotten easier? Has it gotten more difficult? There's a lot more Android devices than there is iOS devices. So I can imagine that's a challenge. So do you find that over the last few years, development has gotten easier, or is it just different?
I would say it's gotten a lot easier. I do want to highlight, and thank you for pointing out that Android is really solving a harder problem than iOS is as an operating system. The diversity of devices, and not just handsets either, that Android is trying to approach is really impressive and technically challenging. To be able to operate with all these third-party OEMs hand in glove is tough, and also to produce handsets that are affordable in a lot of nations that maybe don't enjoy the same privilege that you and I do. That's a very challenging technical problem. So I would say, depending on what year you've asked me, I would say Android was maybe quite a bit more challenging than iOS development.
Yeah.
And now it's gotten a lot better.
If you're looking at the future of Android development, would you say that that's still a challenge, or do you think that people are falling more and more of a specific hardware setup, a specific framework that's helping it? Or because again, I mean, I remember when there was the Incredible and it seemed such a wide range of handsets, but now that I'm looking at the Samsungs and the Pixels, they start to seem to be coming together a little more closely. Is that accurate, or would you say that's not?
It's really difficult, I think, to talk about the Android device ecosystem in a concise way. It's just so complex and large and ever-changing. I would say, the headline is definitely that Android development is getting a lot simpler, and there are a fair number of things that are contributing to that. I want to highlight the great work that the Android Tools team is doing. Those folks they're doing incredible work. I've worked with various developer tools produced by various teams. That is going a long way to make the development experience better. The framework teams, similarly, are doing great work. I think a development that we've seen just in the last year at Google that's one of the bigger things is Google's not necessarily being more prescriptive right now, but they are offering more guidance about a sane default for a way to approach things. I think historically, Android development, more so than iOS development, there were countless quote-unquote right ways to do a thing.
Sure. Okay.
Whereas Apple has tended to be a bit more prescriptive with their platform. And a little bit of guidance from Google right now is already going a long way, I think.
Why do you think it is that a lot of people still these days focus on an iOS first path when they're launching their application first versus an Android one? Is it because of that more complexity in the hardware set, or what's your take on why that's still kind of the, again, air quotes, obvious path that startups take?
I can say that I've seen that more in the past than I have just recently.
Okay.
I've started to see more clients approaching us with an Android first approach. I'm very open-minded. I'm fine taking either approach first. I can say that in some situations, iOS is going to be the right approach because it's going to be maybe a little bit faster to iterate. I think that those situations are becoming less numerous as the Android platform matures. I think also there's probably some bias. If we were to survey senior stakeholders, decision makers, just what's your primary device? Are you an iOS user or an Android user? I think that we'd find that probably the majority, and maybe that's changing too, have been iOS users, and that bias is definitely part of the decision making process. Makes
sense. And so let's keep talking to those people that are starting up. They want to get started. What's some of the first things that if you were coaching somebody basically across the bar on where to start when it comes to developing a mobile application? I mean, what are some of the first things that you would want somebody to consider, maybe a top three, like that they should be focused on first?
So the first one is definitely my favorite. The first thing I always counsel people to focus on when they're looking to get into native mobile app development is, do you actually need or want a native mobile app? You can definitely take this to the bank. I don't make web applications. I don't do server-side development personally. I only make native mobile apps.
Sure.
So if I'm counseling a client or a peer and I'm like, well, I just don't know that you necessarily need a native mobile app, you could probably take that to the bank. The reason I bring that up, the reason that that's important is making native mobile apps well is really quite challenging. And there are plenty of situations where you genuinely do need a native mobile application. And there are a lot of situations where at first glance you might think you need a native mobile application and you just don't.
I'm a founder. I want to build my first mobile application. One of the things I should first consider is, do I need a native application, right? What are some of the other things? Let's say I've determined, yep, gonna have to do that. What are some of the next steps, other things that I should be really considering before I either go to find some developers or hire developers or whatever the case may be?
Specifically with regards to building your team, I would strongly advise working with at least one person that really understands native mobile development. There are a lot of great developers out there. trying to think of some of the developers I've worked with that are contributing in Android, but maybe JVM historically, Java engineers. They come in, they bring a lot of systems, architecture strength, a lot of fundamental strength. They just don't really understand the platform of Android when they start out. And that can lead to, if you don't have the right guidance, some more negative outcomes for the project you might like or the product.
Is that a how versus why kind of conversation, right? Like, yeah, I know how to make it do this thing, but why am I making it do this thing? That's something I find not just in mobile development, but in any kind of software development where the true top dog developers that I've worked with really go for an understanding of why we're doing it this way, and then from there the how is just easy. I mean, that's just doing your job. Would you say that that's also been a focus for you as somebody who's working in mobile development, is really understand why, not just why the application, but why this interaction, why this API, all those, all and above? Has that been a big consideration for you?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's not just a challenge for native mobile engineers. I think that's a challenge for any large, complex software project.
Yeah.
I mean, your engineering team, right down to the individual contributors, are constantly making tons of small decisions that leadership, for whatever definition of leadership, are not going to be involved in. And at the end of the day, as much hard work as we put into requirements, not every tiny decision is going to be clearly documented. So having every member of the team truly understand the why behind things, just in general, I think is key. And I think that definitely applies to native mobile specific things as well.
And what are some of the considerations I should be thinking about after launch, once it goes live? What are some of the things that you've commonly seen that people maybe take for granted or miss on the backside of development?
Yeah, there are a lot. So the first one that comes to mind is kind of a no-brainer, and I bring it up early on in every engagement, and it seems to be forgotten until the last minute in every engagement. And that's your product listing, your app store listing.
Oh, sure.
For Android and iOS. You need copy and assets, and there are actually some pretty fancy tools that can allow you to do A/B testing even with your listing, and having the right people generating that content and vetting that content, iterating on it, and evaluating what impact it's having on conversions. I mean, that's often overlooked and fairly significant.
It is, Sarah. It is significant. I mean, it's your billboard for your app. After you spent all that money, you want to make sure it looks really good before, or when you're enticing somebody to hit the download button and install it on their phone. Let's switch gears a little bit. Let's move to the design side of the house. Honestly, in my experience, when design and app development meet is sometimes some of the areas where I've seen some of the biggest challenges. What are some of the opportunities you've seen working with user experience folks on what you need as a mobile developer in order to be successful?
I'm really glad we're talking about this. There's so much opportunity here.
Isn't there?
Yeah.
Well, like I said, that's where I've seen some of the biggest either great successes or some of the biggest crashes and burns when that, and again, I'm going to use air quotes, handoff happens, which I don't believe there should be a handoff, but as you know, sometimes it just works out that way.
Yeah, so I would say the first and most important thing, and this might sound a little bit obvious, is your designers really need to be intimately familiar with the conventions and design guidelines for your iOS and Android platforms. And to be clear about why this isn't just an opinion and why there's real impact on your business for this. So let's say I'm a designer that's not familiar with iOS and Android conventions. And I advise using this custom widget for both iOS and Android, where iOS has widget A and Android has widget B that is kind of a platform convention. So if I'm a designer and I draw a hard line that my custom widget is what should be used for this, there are a few drawbacks. The first is that it's going to take more effort to build.
Sure.
So if that designer instead had presented two separate designs with widget A and widget B respectively, then your engineers are going to know immediately what that is, and they're going to be able to produce something and get you to market faster. Next, think about user considerations. I, as a user on iOS, am not familiar with the